Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna episode 163. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres looking after the historic documents of the Highlands of Scotland. We have one in Inverness, one in Fort William, one in Portree and one in Wick. Learn with Lorna, if you've been watching for a while, you'll know was started during lockdown 4 years ago now, I think, with the view of bringing our collections to people in their houses when they weren't able to visit our centres. There were originally 14 episodes planned, and we're now up to episode 163. So yes, constantly ongoing project. This series is brought to you by Highlife Highland at no cost to the viewer. Highlife Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. If you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really very grateful for that. Yes, Linda, I'm seeing your message that it's grey in Northern Ireland. It is blowing a hoolie here as well, so I'm hoping that you can hear me and that everything works fine. So welcome to episode 163, where once again we're looking at stories from one particular community, and I think these always gather interest from people who either are not in the area and then decide they want to go there, or are local and can add to the stories themselves. So in this case we are looking at stories from Fortrose, situated on the Black Isle, about 15 miles northeast of Inverness, about 15 miles east of Dingwall. And the story of Fortrose is intrinsically linked to the story of Rosemarkie, as the two towns are so close together. Both Rosemarkie and Fortrose have long and fascinating histories. So let's start with an extract from the first statistical account for the parish of Rosemarkie, so this will be written in the 1790s, describing Rosemarkie. The town of Rosemarkie, though not large, is of considerable antiquity. It was erected into a royal borough by Alexander, King of Scotland. Which of them is not specified, but it was probably Alexander II. About a mile to the west of it stands the town of Shannonry, so called from its being the Shannonry of Ross, where the bishop formerly had his residence and which is now the presbytery seat. It was united to the borough of Rosemarkie by a charter granted by King James II, anno 1444, under the common name of Fortrose, now softened into Fortrose, which charter was ratified by King James VI, anno 1592, and confirmed in still more ample form by the same monarch in the year 1612. These charters bear that it was to be entitled to all the privileges, liberties and immunities granted to the town of Inverness. Fortrose is then spoken of as a town flourishing in the arts and sciences, having been at this time the seat of divinity, law and physic in this corner of the kingdom. So you can see straight away from that how linked those two places are, an intertwined story of Rosemarkie and Fortrose and Shannonry as it was called originally. Incidentally, we hold a 1455 letter by King James II which references those rights that had been granted to Fortrose. Now, for many years, Shannonry, as it was at that point, was subordinate to and therefore answered to Rosemarkie, which was the borough. But the decline of Rosemarkie led Parliament to transfer the borough rights to Fortrose, where they remained. This extract from our Borough of Fortrose catalogue gives the next part of the story of what happened after Fortrose took those borough rights and became the more prominent of the two. Remaining a royal borough, Fortrose became a police borough as well in 1867 under the terms of the General Police and Improvement Scotland Act 1862. Governed by a provost, 3 bailies, a dean of guild, a treasurer and 9 councillors who acted as police commissioners. For its parliamentary representation it united with Inverness, Forres and Nairn to return 1 MP. After adopting the Borough Police Scotland Act 1892, the town was governed by a provost, 2 bailies and 7 other commissioners. From 1930, it was classed as a small borough under the Local Government Scotland Act 1929 and retained this status until 1975, in which year Fortrose Town Council was abolished under the terms of the Local Government Scotland Act 1973. The borough's population stood at 1,148 in 1851 and at 1,081 in the 1971 census, the last that was conducted before the Town Council's abolition. You've heard me many times talk about all the changes that 73 Act brought when it came to pass in 1975 with the end of the boroughs and the change of the counties and so on. A hugely transformative point from our point of view as record keepers. So, like all of our boroughs, you can see there a story of trade, a story of education, of religion, of status, and a story of rise and fall. And that is the same in all of these kind of prominent towns and villages that I'm going to talk about through this series, like Dingwall, like Inverness. So as always, when I'm looking at a borough, my first port of call is the borough records. And for Fortrose, it's a great collection. As soon as I started to look into it, I thought I'm not going to need to look at anything else. There's so much in the borough papers. There are town council minutes, accounts, letter books, copies of charters, records to do with housing and buildings and all sorts of things to do with the running and operation of the town. So let's start in my favourite place, the town council minutes. And the earliest volume that we hold for Fortrose is from 1674 to 1710. And to my great, extraordinary delight when I went to look at them, these are indexed, which is very unusual for this date. This is a typed transcript, so a word for word, typed exactly with the same spellings and so on, but not the original handwritten for this volume. But that meant that when whoever had typed it at some point has indexed it. And I described myself yesterday as being in the heights of ecstasy when I realised that the 1674 entries were indexed and made it much more quick for me to look through and find things. Now, like all borough minutes, these give insights into the routine of the town. General running, things like the customs, the markets, the finances, etc. Markets seem to have been a particular hot topic in Fortrose. I don't know if anyone is watching from Fortrose or knows anyone there. Let me know if there's still frequent riots when there's a market. I found so many references across years and years to the risk of chaos and riot whenever there was a market day. Inhabitants constantly being warned to behave and not run riot. So for instance, this is an entry from 15th of March 1697. A borough court of the borough of Fortrose was held in the ordinary meeting place the 15th day of March 1697. And you'll see I'm reading this from the original spelling, so if I stumble it's because everything is spelt differently and there's abbreviations and things. The said day, the burgesses and inhabitants of the said borough being convened, were enjoined and ordained by the said magistrates to be sober all the time of the present and ensuing market now in hand, and to be civil to all men and strangers coming hereto, and to give no offence or to do no wrong to any, so that they will be answerable and under pain of censure and liable to pay fines. They have to be ready on all occasions to attend and be assisting to the magistrates in case of tumult or uproar at the time of the market for suppressing the same, and likewise to be assisting and helping the town guards and the town customer if the cause requires. So don't riot, don't cause bother, and if anything kicks off, you are duty bound to help. It then goes on to say that the same day the magistrates and those of the council present, who were Thomas Gare, Donald Davidson, William Talmy, William Reid, Robert Wilson and George Graham, found it expedient and conform to the former custom of this place to appoint the town guard for beginning this day until the end of the market. And therefore they enacted, and they list all the people who they have to be part of the town guard while the market is on, and that they have to, whoever's in charge of it, which is Peter Hay, has to have at his command soldiers with their best arms and weapons. So like I say, you sort of get the feeling it really, really did kick off in Fortrose on a market day. This minute, as I say, it goes on to deal with all of the things that might happen if there is any kind of a fray or uproar. But these minute books, the volumes of the town council, also detail the other things that they had to deal with, the borough officials. So things such as crimes, like this case of William Pedeston. After which, the said day, the bailies held a borough court and acted as follows. The said day, William Pedeston in Fortrose being accused by the Procurator Fiscal of stealing and away taking a harrow, tines, and all of iron, but from taken away implements belonging to the Countess of Seaforth, further of her cornyard in Fortrose, on one or other of the days of the last week, which were found in his house after a search. They go on to say that they have pulled William Pedeston in front of them. He is confessed to being guilty, but declared that he being drunk and thereby not knowing what he was doing, that made him meddle with and carry away the said harrow with its tines and slade tram. So they say, okay, you were drunk, but you've still stolen something, and what's worse, if you've stolen something from the Countess of Seaforth. So they describe what they're going to do and how interesting they say that he is not allowed to win out on bail. It's always interesting when you find these sentences that we use all the time and see them hundreds of years ago. But what they do say was that he is to be taken away, he's to be charged a sum of £10, but also he's to be put in prison within the place called the Thief's Hole until he pays the same. It goes on to say that if he should ever, after he's released, be found guilty of theft again, that he would be banished from the borough and the territories and scourged, so whipped through the streets by the hand of the hangman, and if found thereafter in this borough, he shall be processed of anew as a thief and be punished for this and his future faults. So it's pretty brutal and pretty there's not many ways out of that. It's a pretty heavy sentence. There are other references that I came across to the Thief's Hole, but not many, so I don't know any more about that. I do know that in Inverness they had a Thief's Hole within the bridge over the river, so it's possible that it's something similar to that. At some point later it describes it as a cellar referred to as the Thief's Hole, so it could just be within the jail. So far I've kind of given you some negative extracts from the Borough Council. There are happier occasions referenced too, although interesting to me that when this particular extract that I'm going to read you, they saw it as a happy occasion and they could have no idea of the upheaval that the country was about to be thrown into after it. This is a meeting held, an entry made on the 2nd of July 1688. If you are familiar with your British history, or if you have been watching me talk for a while, you might know why 1688 is a particularly traumatic time. A council meeting of the Borough of Fortrose holden within the ordinary meeting place thereof on the 2nd day of July 1688 years by Robert Innes, Dod Davidson Baileys, David Moneypenny, Alexander Spideman, William Moneypenny, really interesting names, Hugh Bailey, Andrew Miller, Thomas Gare and William Thompson, councillors. That said day, Robert Innes Bailey produced in council the Act of His Majesty's Privy Council for the solemn and public thanksgiving to be made for the birth of the most serene and high-born Prince, the Prince and Stewart of Scotland, the Prince of Wales, etc., and declared that the day appointed by the Act for the end foresaid was elapsed, so they've missed the date that they were supposed to celebrate the birth of the baby. But it was over before this Act came into his hands. And because the people and inhabitants of this borough cannot now sooner than tomorrow, the 3rd, signify their subtle marks of joy and congratulation for the birth of the said prince, therefore those in the council ordained the said act in the first place to be read in council, and being accordingly done with a great deal of joy and satisfaction, they in the next place ordained that the magistrates, councillors and whole burgesses and inhabitants of this borough meet in the churchyard tomorrow at the knell of the bell or the tuck of the drum. I might call my autobiography that, the knell of the bell or the tuck of the drum. So they have to go to all the inhabitants have to meet the next day when they're summoned to go to church to hear the sermon and to return in one body under arms to the cross of Fortrose, there to use their solemnity and unwont for that end during the magistrate's pleasure. So they have to celebrate the birth of the baby. and that the collector and the customer of the borough will defray all the expenses. But again, as we see from other things, that the bailies have to take care that all things be as ordered and as decently gone about, and that all is well as possible, and stated that anyone who is not absent will suffer under the highest pain. So very interesting that they are marking the birth of this baby, they're celebrating, but that birth was of James Francis Edward Stuart, and it would be the catalyst for the Jacobite risings, which would rage through the country for the next 60 years. Outside the minutes, so far I've talked largely about the Borough Council minutes, but outside that there are other borough records which reveal a wealth of detail about other insights into life in the area. There are bundles of correspondence dealing with subjects as diverse as wrongful dismissal in 1733, evictions from property across the years. I found a really interesting one that talks about evicting a load of people from a tenement, which seems like an unusual word at the time, but a tenement, requiring people to remove themselves, their wives, their bairns, their families, their goods and gears, and leave the property entirely void. In 1718, one of the issues that the Borough Council are dealing with is the theft of rope. So have a listen to this, and again I'm reading it direct from the handwritten, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit. That where in the latter end of September or the beginning of October 1718 there was stolen and away taken from a boat belonging to the said Alexander Tolm, lying on the shore of Shannonry, a dreg, so a dredger boat, with 6 fathom of a head rope consisting of 18 fathoms, which having been examined after the dreg was found. Stumbling, see I told you I would. So there's a ship that has been taken and rope has been taken. They have investigated and they have found that the dreg was found with Alexander Gunn, John Munro, David Taylor and John Ross, indwellers in the said borough, who acknowledged to have taken away and are still willing to restore the same. So they admit that they've taken the boat. But in regard to the said 6 fathoms of head rope that is still a missing, and that the whole is rendered useless thereby, those forenamed persons in whose custody the dreg was found have all one and equally denied that they've taken the rope. But it goes on to say that that the law or the borough court think that they should be found not should be found guilty, but they should be found liable for it being gone missing, and they should be equally responsible. And so it says that they have to pay £10 and 16 shillings, a huge amount of money, £10 and 16 shillings Scots money as the real and true value of the said 18 fathoms of rope, allowing them to make up the remainder with such expenses and damages as they see fit for justice. So they're required to pay for the missing item, but also to pay costs. And the reason I've kind of pulled that one out to talk about is, you know, it's a bit of rope that's been stolen, but that's a severe loss to someone whose livelihood was dependent on the sea and dependent on that boat. And like almost all of our royal boroughs, both in the Highlands and further afield, Fortrose is on the coast, and that relationship with the sea is absolutely central to the area's story. Of course it is. There are protests in the borough papers against the weather. These are fascinating. So ships have been damaged by storms and their captains are protesting their innocence in the damage. So they're writing to the town council against a supposed accusation that they've done something wrong, to say this is a protest against the weather and we're not liable for the damage. There are papers within the Inverness Borough papers that detail the claim of 2 fishermen who were apprehended by Jacobites in 1715. Apprehended by Jacobites while out fishing at sea. They were fishing in the Barbara of Inverness, and they were taken by force to Fortrose and held prisoner for 7 days. So that link with the sea and the coast is integral, and I've said this so many times on previous episodes, but all settlements on the sea have that relationship where the sea brings fortune and food, but also brings hardship, and frequently brings loss and difficulty. In the Borough Papers, and I will move on from the Borough Papers, like I said, they're just so rich, I also found this really fascinating drama which unfolded in 1867. I came to the story through a complaint, a legal complaint by John Finney against the Town Council of Fortrose, which the Town Council have been instructed to give their answers to. And this is how they describe the situation. And incidentally, all the Town Council concur about what's happened. I'm only going to read snippets from it because it's a really long document, but I will read quite a bit because it is particularly interesting. The petitioner, Mr. John Finney, was, so this is the Town Councillors writing back to the court in reply to the charge. The petitioner, Mr. John Finney, was in or about 1866 appointed Town Clerk of the Royal Borough of Fortrose, and he obtained possession of the whole books, records and papers of this borough. At the ordinary meeting of the Town Council held on the 17th of October 1867, the Town Clerk was instructed to prepare the usual annual statement of the borough's accounts for the year from 10th of October 1866 to 10th of October 1867. The accounts of the borough are simple, as its funds are of small amount, and the annual account for the year 66-67 could have been prepared in a few days. The clerk, however, did not submit any draft of the account until the 9th of March 1868, when he produced a very voluminous account into which the council found it quite impossible to enter. The account was remitted to the Finance Committee to consider and to report. The draft accounts prepared by the petitioner were never submitted to or considered by the Finance Committee. So John Finney has been asked to write up the accounts as usual in his role as Town Clerk. He has taken a long time to do it, and then instead of just doing a very simple summary, has gone into huge levels of detail, and then the Finance Committee have not been allowed to examine it. The petitioner, so this is John Finney, states that at the meeting of the 6th of April 1868 the accounts were directed to be printed and published, but this is not the case. They have never been examined, and the petitioner himself does not pretend that they were ever approved of in any way. They were not signed by the Provost, or the Treasurer, or the Chamberlain, but in point of fact they had never been seen by anyone but Finney, the Town Clerk himself. In this state of matters, the petitioner, without authority of the Town Council, thought fit at his own hand to print, publish and circulate what he called the public accounts of the Corporation of the Borough of Fortrose, with appendices. This document extended to 28 printed folio pages. It bears to be signed by the petitioner as auditor, although the petitioner had never been appointed auditor and had no authority to sign or to publish these accounts. So he's causing upset in the Town Council. The accounts, therefore, were unwarrantably printed and published by the petitioner when they were found on examination by individual members of the council to be in various respects incorrect. The petitioner had also inserted numerous states, notes and explanations of a most objectionable description, containing statements incorrect in point of fact and involving serious charges against many of the citizens of Fortrose. Instead of confining himself to the accounts of the borough for the year as requested, the petitioner had gone back upwards of 10 years, with the view apparently of finding any fault with the previous accounts of the borough and stating objections to any of the borough's expenditure. So, he's published this that he's not been asked to publish, he's written something he's not been asked to written, he's not letting anybody look at it. A full council meeting was called as a result of this, and it was agreed by the entire council that they would disclaim those accounts that had been illegally published and that they would have the accounts redone. However, the Town Clerk, Finney, now refused to do so, and in fact he refused to do anything. He refused to write down any of the conversations. So even though the whole council agreed that they would have the accounts redone, he refused to minute it, even though it had been proposed and seconded. So he said he wouldn't write down anything. The town councillors then asked that the accounts be submitted to an independent accountant for review instead, but the town clerk refused this as well. It goes on to say an angry discussion succeeded, in the course of which 3 members of the council walked out, although they did later return. It goes on to say that by now it was getting dark. I don't know what time they started the meeting, but by now it was getting dark, and the provost, trying to close the meeting, requested that he could have the borough records back, and they would come back to the question. And this is what it says next. At this stage, the petitioner, Finney, again interposed, declared that he was the custodian of the whole books and papers of the borough, and he refused to part with them, or refused to allow them to be submitted to any accountant whatsoever. This led to another angry altercation, in the course of which some of the members of the council took up the books and papers lying on the table and handed them to the provost for custody. This was violently resisted by the petitioner, who threatened personal violence and attempted forcibly to wrestle all the books back from the members of the council who were collecting them. Beyond this, however, there was no violence of any kind, but there was a great deal of angry altercation. Ultimately, the petitioner stated that he would give up the books and papers, provided he got an inventory and receipt so as to free him from responsibility. This was agreed to, and an inventory was subsequently made at the site of the petitioner himself. Eventually, one of the councillors, Councillor Watson, took control of the records, and Mr. Finney was given continued access to them. They said, "We just want to take them for safekeeping, but you are able to continue to access and look at them." But they did note in their answers to this charge, in consequence of the declinature of the petitioner to act as town clerk, no minute has been prepared of the meeting of the 19th of June, and the business of the town is standing still, because he refuses to minute anything. The respondents and the other members of the town council had hoped that on consideration the petitioner might have seen right to resume his duties, call another meeting of the council, and get the accounts laid before a neutral accountant or otherwise adjusted. Instead of doing so, he has thought proper to present the present most groundless petition and complaint. The respondents and the whole other members of the council are most anxious that the accounts should be adjusted, that the business of the town should be proceeded with, and that there should be good feeling between them and the town clerk. The respondents, and it is believed the whole other members of this council, regret extremely the unseemly scenes which occurred on the 19th of June, but for which the respondents humbly think the petitioner is to blame. So there you go. I haven't investigated it any further, but it does go on to show that it does go to show that town council meetings are not boring. And sometimes when people assume that, you know, we look after the town council's old minutes or the Highland Council's old minutes and that they're going to be boring, there's all sorts of dramas and fights and altercations and people walking out going on. And I wonder if the accounts, someone had obviously fiddled the accounts to some extent, or did they? Who knows? So I've mentioned there that lots of references to the town council. Fortrose had a long religious history as well. Its cathedral was of particular importance, but as well as that, it had a long has still a long and distinguished connection to education. And I was really struck by this as I started to look through all these records. I found a payment in those earliest borough minutes for Peats in the 1650s to Anna Maxwell, the schoolmistress. 1650s. There is a 1725 document in which the magistrates enable a Mrs. Elizabeth Cock to set up a school for the educating of young women. And the magistrates note that they are very keen that this should happen. They say that they have considered for a long time the great loss that the town sustains through the want of a proper person to keep a school for educating young women. They agree as a town council to find a building, to pay for a building, and to give her a salary of £20 per annum for educating the women of the town. Fortrose Academy, which is still going strong, and in the next year, in the new year, I've got some Fortrose Academy pupils coming in to look at some records. It was formed in 1791, growing out of the grammar school which had already existed for well over a century in the town. It had, as well, from the early 1800s, an attached library which had the aim of providing rational instruction and innocent entertainment to the citizens of Fortrose. And I found a really lovely, it's about 10-page description written in about 1818 of the Fortrose librarian, describing the state of the library, the books they have, the people who are subscribing, and the benefits that are being brought to the town. But to go back to Fortrose Academy, like all institutions with a long history, there have been highs and lows in the Academy's story. In the early years, there was some trouble with teacher behaviour. It's recorded, maybe they'd been at the market, it was recorded in the Shannonry Presbytery minutes that the behaviour of the teachers was not always what might be expected. But I wanted to share with you, coming much more up to date, a high point from the school's history. This is from a booklet, a journal written by school pupils at Fortrose Academy in 1990, and they're describing the great excitement that the school has come to with the arrival of Amstrad computers. This is the Business Studies Department writing. There was much delight when the first batch of Amstrad word processors arrived in our department. The first standard grade class and the senior classes could not wait to get their hands on them. Ruth and Tara were heard to gloat that they could throw their Tipex away. In fact, they wondered how the Tipex company would even survive the loss of sales from Fortrose Academy. The S3 Office and Information Studies pupils have been helping out in the office on a rota basis. They have each returned in high spirits to relate their experiences. It was brilliant. They were all super to me, replied Amy and Lisa together. Similar comments were made by the others. Members of the S6 class helped out with the Abbeyfield Society in Inverness. Letters, agendas, minutes and waiting lists were completed with great dexterity. Reports, S2 to S6 pupil council minutes were completed so very willingly as part of the ongoing work-related duties. Visitors to the department would be hard put to decide whether they had walked into a secretarial class or an accounting class, as now the Amstrads are used equally for both. S3 to S4 accounts love Supercalc, trading, profit and loss accounts and balance sheets all come zooming from the printers as checks on written work. The number of Amstrads in our department is now 34 and rising, with 3 exclamation marks. Just like I say, I could have gone into any point of the history of education in the borough, but I thought let's come to something much more modern, 1990s, and that excitement of that tech revolution. Fortrose, of course, appears in our deposited collections as well as those of the Highland Council, and so far I've almost exclusively spoken about the Borough Council and the County Council minutes, but it does of course appear in our deposited collections as well. I've spoken before about Anne Fraser's diary and the Bailey of Denane collection, in which people talk about visiting Fortrose, but I wanted to finish with something from D69, a collection of papers and letters gathered by antiquarian Tom Skinner and covering the dates 1775 to 1914. It's a very varied collection, as anything like that is, that doesn't come from a family or a business, it comes from a person who has collected out of interest. So it's a very diverse collection. But I'm going to finish by focusing on a small series within that collection of letters sent by Colin Watson in Jamaica back to Bernard Williamson in Fortrose in the late 1700s. There is no doubt that Fortrose, like the rest of the country, benefited from money made in the Caribbean on plantations run on the labour of enslaved people. There's so much evidence for the fact that large swathes of Scotland benefited from that money. And in fact, these particular letters make it clear that Colin Watson was remitting money back home to be shared amongst his family in Fortrose. His letters, such as this one that I'm going to share with you from November 1781, give a very, very detailed description of life in the Caribbean in the 1700s. I'm going to read a couple of different extracts that describe a hurricane which devastated the island in 1781. As I will always say when I'm reading something like this, you'll hear me inserting alternate words because there are words that I wouldn't be comfortable reading out. So, 13th of November 1781. Most of the estates had several people killed in this hurricane. Now commenced hardships to be endured by many who from their infancy had been bred in affluence. Cottages and huts had to be contrived from the ruins of elegant dwellings to keep ladies, children and gentlemen from the inclemency of the weather, and to live on such food as accident put in their way. The feathered tribe, almost tame and wild, almost annihilated. Small stock, viz. Hogs, sheep, goats, etc., mostly destroyed. Furniture, apparel of all kinds shared the same fate. Provisions, liquors, rum, sugar, the same. So that people of immense fortune were now poor indeed. Indeed, they who had the most property felt most. Some 200, 300, or 400 more enslaved people to feed. Now very little to be got for them, for the plantains, their only support, being destroyed. Nor could any assistance be expected in less than 9 months, even in the best of seasons. The whole depends now on yams, etc., still in the ground, but not fit for use at that very time. So much rain for the 7 weeks before rendered them all too watery. So not only have they lost all crops, all animals, all food, but the food that's coming up through the ground is also ruined. As to provisions, the greatest part of the parish was as badly off as to leeward. As soon as the roads were passable, I had occasion to go through a great part of Westmoreland and Hanover. All carpenters, masons and planters, such gentlemen as were not handy in the two former, either acted as labourers to the tradesmen or attended their enslaved people in the fields. The cane field was overlooked as not worthy of much notice. Many raked and ploughed. Everybody planted corn, peas, potatoes, etc., and all such as would yield food quickest to prevent a famine. But to the regret of many thousands, the ensuing dry season rendered all our expectations abortive, as very little was reaped from what was done. So everybody basically saying, pulling weight to try and make sure there's food and not a famine, but then having had all that rain, the hurricane, the storm, they then have a drought. It goes on in a different section of the letter to say that he wanted more details about this hurricane. So the papers described it very right. It was not by many degrees as violent here as it was to leeward and southerly, and less so to windward, although we had several houses thrown down, and many much damaged, and the country round suffered much by the destruction of plantain trees and other provisions. But in Westmoreland and Hanover parishes, nothing did stand its violence, except some stone-built windmill towers. Next morning exhibited to our view a piteous scene. Near us, the few trees close by were dismantled of the verdure, fences all thrown down, and all things growing appeared blasted. And as the weather cleared up, it was truly affecting. Our view towards the fertile country of Hanover is very extensive, as it forms part of a semicircle inverted. The many fine estates and elegant buildings were in ruins. The lofty mountains ranged along the coast, dismantled of their ornaments, the growth of ages destroyed. Nothing to be seen but stumps of trees, and they very thinly spread, 9/10 of the whole being thrown down. The loftiest trees giving way first, the smallest either broke off halfway or so up the trunks, or twisted like cables according to the quality of their timber. The town of Savannah-la-Mar on the south side, about 35 miles across the country from here, was totally destroyed. The assize court being then sitting, many had run to that house considering it strong, the lower story being of stone about 10 feet high. Early in the afternoon it suffered, but although they had light, whither could they fly? The land being very level there and for several miles around, the sea rose 15 feet perpendicular. A ship in the harbour drove beyond the gable of the courthouse. Sloops and brigs were hurled up the country among mangroves, houses wrecked, tossed to and fro, multitudes of people, both black and white, sharing the same fate. And the courthouse went, many people perished. It took several weeks to clear the wrecks and bury the bodies, which was extremely offensive and threatened a pestilence. So I'm not finishing on a particularly cheery note at all, but I think, I think it's really beautifully written. It's very, very evocative, I think. But also it illustrates that, like so many places in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, not only the money that was coming back from the Caribbean to benefit this area at what cost, but also it illustrates the fact that the people of Fortrose were not only intimately connected with the events happening in their local area, their churches, their market days and so on, but that events happening thousands of miles away were known to them and felt by them. I hope that has been of some interest. If you're in Fortrose, share more stories with me. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit. It's hard when you're talking about somewhere that's existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to try and cram some stories in. So I'm sorry if there was a story you were expecting that didn't come out. Next week, we will again be looking at connections to places far removed from the Highlands, as we're looking at our connections to Australia and New Zealand. So hopefully that will be of interest to you, and you'll be able to join me next week. A reminder again that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. And thank you for your comments. I'm glad that you found that interesting. Thank you.